Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Royal Grown Radio. Thank you all for joining us today. We are here at the Mad River Pump Station in beautiful Arcata, California. River flowing behind us, sun shining down, getting ready for spring. So this time of year, the sun starts breaking through and everyone starts thinking about garden prep. And today I wanted to invite our good friend, our soil scientist, teacher of soil science at Cal Poly Humboldt, and as always, Rick Elliott.
Hey, greetings all.
To come together and talk a little bit about garden prep, spring prep, and what we're doing at Royal Gold to make sure everyone at home has the best quality soil this spring season. So I'll dig right in by saying one of the most important things to do on large scale gardens is testing, and that's one of the reasons we got the soil scientist here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about what to test for if you're going to test, how to proceed if you're not going to test, on getting some amendments going. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we do at Royal Gold to test our product, what we're doing at the factory to make sure everyone out there in the world has that fresh product. So starting off, up here in Humboldt, we have a ton of rain all season. How does that leave our garden beds and pots?
So yeah, if you're talking about pots and beds that have been left outside, I mean this year especially, I'm not sure where we're at for rainfall, but it's pretty significant.
Big time.
Potting media, whether it's cocoa or peat based, doesn't really matter with that amount of rain. Can't really hold on to much. Just doesn't really have that ability to resist the leaching. So if you've got stuff sitting out from fall into early spring, it's pretty likely you don't really have much fertility left in your mix at all, and it's time to get it tested and get it amended.
Yeah, that's a good call. And you know, a lot of folks may not have the resources or energy to want to get it tested, but whether testing or not, you got to get some nutrients back in there somehow, right?
Definitely.
So a lot of what we've talked about and worked together on, Nate, is amending and trying to find ways to get that soil revitalized and releasing nutrients for a good start, and then continuing to feed as the plant's needs change throughout the season. Tell us a little bit, just from your perspective as a soil scientist, about what that process entails and how to go about it.
Yeah, so like I said, by the time spring has come here on the North Coast with all the rains, you usually have something close to a blank slate, right? It's not even like buying it out of the bag, because almost all mixes are going to have some sort of a amendment in them. But by the end of spring, we usually have pretty little left. So now's the time where if things didn't work last year, make a new plan, right?
Yeah.
If things got too tall, if they didn't get big enough, whatever your issues were, now you can kind of readjust that, because like I said, you're starting over. So if you do have the ability to get things tested, that's really going to set you up. You'll know your pH, you'll know your EC, if you need to adjust the acidity in your soil, because a lot of times the rain is going to drive that pH down, right? It's time to correct your pH if you need to. Your EC is probably really low, so depending on what you're growing, when you're starting, if you're starting from seeds, or if you're putting in some significantly bigger plants, you can kind of tailor the fertility that you need to get going. There's so many different styles of doing it, but dry amendments tend to be a lot cheaper in cost in the long run, and they're also going to provide some organic carbon for all the microbes in your soil to keep growing. So if you're adding compost or worm castings, getting some other organic source of fertilizer in there is really a way to get your plants off to a good start.
That's a great point. I've never really thought about that too much, as far as not just throwing out a blanket amendment charge to your old soil, but to kind of cater it to what you may be planning on doing this season, or maybe what you experienced the season before.
Yeah,
so that's cool.
If you're doing home veggie gardens too, I mean, a lot of those different plants are going to have at least slightly different needs, and if you can, rotating is always good. So switching up the crops in between means that you need to switch up your fertility a little bit. You can always go the all-purpose route if you're happy to just get what you get, but if you're looking for higher yields, or you've got the skill and the experience to do it, you can definitely tailor it and get yourself some better product in the end no matter what you're growing.
Right.
That's a great point, and it makes sense to me that, you know, more advanced growers deeper down are gonna take that extra step, whether it be for yield, whether it be for quality. They're trying to take it that extra level, and maybe they're gonna use like a standardized grow formula or a bloom formula or something like that as a base. But if you get that test, you can still use that kind of simple starting point, but be like, oh, well, I need to grab a little bit of extra high nitrogen something, or extra potassium here to cater to my specific needs. And this bed over here might be different than this bed over here, than different than this pot. So there is a little bit of methodology to getting a good sample to send in. And I know we've talked about this before in some other kind of formats, but that's, I think, a really important point for garden prep is take a clean sample. And you could probably tell people a little better than I some of those methods.
Yeah, sampling, if you don't get a good sample, you don't have good information. If that's what you're basing your crop off of, it's not going to do you very good. So ideally, you want to sample from similar things. So if you've got a bed over here that you've been growing in for the last 5 years and some fresh pots over here, those are two separate samples, right? Just because of the age of them. The style doesn't necessarily matter so much, but you know, if you've got fresh soil from this year versus stuff that's a couple years or 5 years old, those things change over time, especially as you add more amendments to them. So I would try to sample those separately, you know, if possible. It'll get you the best information. If they're all similar though, and you haven't done much more amending other than just adding more fresh soil, like if you're using liquids, especially like inorganic liquids, that's all mainly going to leach out at the end. So that might not be such a big deal. But yeah, sample separately from you can, and you want to grab, you know, multiple samples. So if you've got 100 pots, you know, grab a handful from at least 10 of them, mix it up and send that in. That way you're getting something representative of your group instead of just this one pot out of a big number of them.
Yeah, you're shooting for a law of averages almost.
Yeah. I mean, it's really not worth the time or the money to test for every single pot, right? Like it's overkill, especially if you've been treating those pots more or less the same way throughout your growing season. If you've got like big differences between them, sure, but if you're doing more or less the same thing, you can sample them similarly. The other part is where you get it from. So you always want to try to avoid the top couple inches, no matter if you're in the ground or in pots, in beds, whatever, because that's where the salts tend to accumulate, especially in potting mixes. So you want to avoid that if possible.
I would imagine also then maybe, especially if your soil's, you know, kind of hydrophobic, if it crusts it all and lets things run over and off to the sides, then the sides would also be kind of a skewed sampling point. Yeah,
sides and the top are what you try to avoid. And two, if you're taking samples, like if you're dumping stuff out of a pot, probably avoid the very bottom of it as well. So just like the outer surfaces, really get from the interior where the plant root's actually going to grow.
Do you have any techniques specifically to try to get into the inside without actually hurting roots? You know, if you're sampling while there's plants in the medium.
Yeah. So if you're dealing with smaller pots, that gets a little trickier. But if you're dealing with, you know, 50-gallon, 100-gallon, you can get around it. And that little bit of disturbance you cause with the roots, if you've got a healthy established plant, shouldn't really affect much. So if you're trying to sample mid-season, you can get away with it. But small pots, like I said, it gets harder. And then you kind of just have to end up taking a real small amount from a lot more pots.
Sure. That's kind of what I just did recently. They were 5-gallon pots, and I kind of burrowed my 1 or 2 fingers in, dug a hole about 3 or 4 inches in, and kind of used the crane technique with my finger. Yeah. You know, tried to burrow out as much as I could without actually damaging
even like a little kitchen spoon.
Sure.
Whatever you got will work. If you are using something, make sure it's not rusty, because that will change the iron levels in your soil test for sure. So yeah, no matter what you're using, if it's finger, if it's spoon, just make sure that it's clean and especially not rusty, because that rust will throw off the iron levels in your sample and give you some false information.
Excellent. And I know iron's a very important nutrient that you want to make sure is there in the proper quantities, so you certainly don't want your test skewed by, you know, little flakes coming off of your trowel.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, avoid rust. And as far as containers, yeah, don't, sample in metal. I mean, Ziploc baggies are fine. Clean, like Tupperware style containers are fine. But metal is something that you just want to avoid if you can, for the same reason.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. So part of what we do at Royal Gold in kind of this same concept is we really focus on testing all of our raw materials, testing as they come together, and testing the final product. And it's a little bit different than maybe a home gardener would do, because we're starting with relatively static inputs that we've created a static recipe based on. So we're making sure that part A is what it's supposed to be, part B is what it's supposed to be, and combining all controlled ingredients together to give the consumer at home a consistent and uniform product. And while the approach is very different in some ways, a lot of the concepts are the same, right? So we're going through those same processes that we encourage people at home to go through, and that is test the raw materials. We make sure that what's going into each batch is the same, that the cocoa fiber every time is washed and buffered to within a very specific tolerance. Our forest materials, also very specific timing, very specific tolerances for pH, for EC. And so we start with this kind of clean slate of all these ingredients and amendments, and then throw them together. And then we need to make sure that it's also consistent after that. So, that's a really big part of what we're doing to protect the consumer at home, but also to give them a uniform starting point. So if you bought King's Mix last year, you can treat it the same if you bought it this year. So you don't have to necessarily go through all those tests if you're replacing your soil every year. You kind of at least have an idea of where you're starting.
Yeah, that's definitely a benefit, out on the road as someone who's educating the public at trade shows and sales trips and yada, yada, yada. That is something that is an eye-opener for a lot of people that have been using potting soils for years and just have never really given it a whole lot of thought to the quality and the energy that we put into every single bag, every product that we make, and with the changes in testing and being organic and having clean product, whether it's for your any kind of consumption. That is something that, I think it's been so overlooked as far as potting media. There's so many products out there that are organic, and people are growing their food for their children, and thinking that it's it's a completely clean and safe medium. But when you start digging in, obviously having this lab and being able to dive into the world of testing, we've learned over the last 5 years specifically that there's a lot of products out there that are clean and labeled organic, or they're labeled organic and clean, but technically they're not really.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a good point. And there's stuff that we have the capability of looking at in our internal lab, Imperial Analytics, and there's stuff that we need to send out to a third party to verify, for things like heavy metals, pesticides, fungicides, these contaminants that come in your raw materials that you need to continually audit and make sure that you're getting a fresh batch that's clean. Poultry products, for one, I know tend to have a lot of issues and have a lot of, pesticides, fungicides, some of the propellants from the miticides and things to keep flies down in the chicken barns. And there's all sorts of antibiotics. There's all sorts of things that enter in a non-organic environment, and then you take those waste products and compost them down, and now it becomes an organic composted product through the system. And it's really important to do your due diligence at home. Take a look, send some things out to a third party if you can afford it, talk to some other people, work together with your community to be like, hey, we're all using this same thing, let's take a look, let's see. So that's a good point, Rick, that is something that we learned with Prop 64 when it started to hit out here in California, and all of a sudden there's these parts per trillion tests and things like this that no one had ever really looked at through this lens. So we try and take it a step further, not only use our third-party independent certified lab, but send out to third-party labs that are not affiliated to get clean information for things we kind of can't test for.
Sure.
And on that note, I guess I want to kind of dive in with you, Nate and Rick, and just talk a little bit about these QC processes at Royal Gold and like why we do some of what we do. Nate, we had what I considered a pretty rigorous quality control program in place when you joined the team, and being the person you are and having the education and background you have, you really changed a lot of that for us and improved it and kind of steered us further down the road we were already heading. What are some of the reasons behind, say, the hourly pH and EC tests we do on the line?
Yeah, we're just trying to keep everything consistent, right? That's what QC is all about. Just trying to make sure that the product that we put out is within a pretty narrow range, so that, like you said, customers using it this spring or last spring, they can expect to get something that's really close. I mean, obviously it's a natural product. There's some variation. There's always going to be some variation in the type of materials that we're working with. Doesn't matter, who's making the potting soil. When you're, dealing with wood products from throughout a whole region, you're going to have a little bit of variation. But the testing that we do tries to ensure that, people's pH, their EC is going to be consistent, so they can kind of count on that when they plant.
Right, and it's not really practical at scale. We're cranking out hundreds of pallets a day. It's not really practical to say do a complete, soil nutrition panel for every hour, but yet we're coming at it from this idea of, all right, well, let's test the things we can test simply hourly, make sure that nothing is deviating, and we'll do batch testing for our daily batches. And that takes us and gives us a lot clearer picture.
Yeah, absolutely. The doing pH and EC, those are quick and easy things that can be done, right? That's going to happen in, a half hour to an hour time frame, instead of running a whole, fertility analysis, which typically is going to take you 2 to 3 days to complete. So we can use that pH and EC to really give us a clue if there's anything off. Right, if we start seeing a high EC, it's almost always because there's a batch of cocoa that maybe didn't get rinsed quite as well. That can get sent back and taken care of real quick. That material can be quarantined and not go out with the rest of the materials. So having those identifiers may not tell us everything, but it gives us a really good indication if things are changing throughout the day.
Right, and by doing it hourly like that, like you said, we have that ability to quarantine, say, testing it 8 a.m.'s great, 9 a.m.'s great, 10 a.m.'s great, 11 a.m.'s great, 12 a.m.'s great, 1 p.m. all of a sudden something's wrong, a test goes off. Well, we have that ability to stop the line and say, whoa, back it up. Where did this go wrong? We know we were still clean at 12, everything between 12 and 1:27 p.m. when this went off. Now we can quarantine, take a closer look, and make sure nothing out of spec is getting out to the customer.
Yeah, for the listeners at home too, when we talk about this whole, batch testing and quality control, we do have a unique batch code system where every product that we put out there to market has a 5-digit embossed or printed stamp on every bag, just above the right seal generally. And that does give us the ability to check out the cocoa, the forest product, how many pallets we made that day. We can pretty much track to, where they were shipping to. It gives us an amazing ability to, see where things are at the day of production, like Michael was saying, but also we keep it in a library for up to a year from the production date. So when a customer has a question about something that was purchased, say 10 months, before, we can actually pull that by that little batch code. We get all that information from the day that it was made. We can compare the results from the day it was made and then retest it and kind of see if things changed over time. And it's a pretty detailed system.
And to take that even a step further, not only can we track back to when your mix was made, we also have all of the information from the forest humus piles, from the cocoa piles, so we can go back and look at the raws as well that we catalog too.
Yeah, all the way to the point where we can say, like, this cocoa that went into this batch came from vendor A, container number 47, and track it just all the way down to the origination of that product hitting our site. And I think it's just a different level of approach. And since you've kind of brought that trackability and that, these levels of fail-safes along the way so that the trackability actually does its job and we can prevent it from going too far askew before that 3-day mark when we're getting an actual soil panel back, it's just been really, really, really great. You know, we had a complaint recently where, you know, somebody got some product that had been sitting in the chain of distribution for too long. It had, you know, sat at a DC, then moved to a store, and then maybe moved to another store in the system. And it wasn't in ideal condition. And so they sent us some pictures and some samples, and our QC department came back and said, okay, well, this is batch XYZ, and I have my sample right here of the original cocoa fiber that went into this batch, retained sample. I have a retained sample of the original made material. I have a sample of the original forest material and all of the data that goes along with it. And we're like, okay, well, it was good when it left here. There's definitely been an issue along the way. Let's figure out how to get this customer taken care of. But then typically we like to request a sample be sent in to us so we can take it a step further, look at what actually happened through our lab, and try and analyze what's gone wrong, whether product in condition like this would be suitable for customer use, wouldn't be suitable for customer use, etc. So it's really an extremely thorough program.
Sure. And it's multi-purpose. It's not just for our own accountability as far as putting out product. You know, there's many times when you can show a customer that the soil is not in question and help them actually figure out what other products they might be adding that might have been causing the issue. A lot of times, you know, soil's always the number one. People are going to think it's the base. You know, that's whether it's heavy metals or insects or any of that stuff. It's generally the first to blame, right? We get the call first. But by that testing, I mean, we could definitely look at like some of the other products, you know, that they would have never thought. A lot of people think, you know, something like arsenic, you know, it's got to come from soil, but a lot of times it's coming from ocean products, you know, and you can actually walk your customers through that process to show where they, you know, they may be failing with something else.
Yeah. One thing that this also really ties to is it's been a really rough year for the entire hydroponic industry, the cannabis industry. Home gardening fared a little better, but overall the kind of cultivation industry took a little bit of a hit in 2022 coming out of COVID, when everyone went home and was stuck home and growing more of everything than any time ever before. More home gardens, more cannabis gardens, more people trying their first 3 plants in the backyard because, hey, we're home. Why not? Let's give this a go. You know, at the end of the year, after a very soft year, after all of that expansion with COVID, there are so many products that have saturated the distribution chain to an extreme degree. And that's something that I really would like to kind of just talk about what you're seeing out there in the world, Nate, Rick, and kind of Nate, some of the things that we've worked together on to do to prevent our product falling into some of these trappings of being old, having issues, sitting on our lot for a long time, and just going out generally in not peak pristine condition after a hard year where the product sat.
Sure, it's definitely one of those things that, you know, we're pushing pretty hard and have for about the last 6 months, I'd say. When going out and sending the crew out to do store visits and stuff is to adamantly catalog the batch codes. And every store we go to, that is like pretty much number one priority right now, is to kind of get an idea of how old that product is, where it came from, so that we do understand, you know, what's happening out in our distribution network, you know. And it was a crazy year. I mean, obviously coming over a 2-year span where it was buy, anything you can get your hands on, to all of a sudden the brakes just got, you know, hit to such an extreme level where everybody bought so much product and then pretty much sat on it. I mean, we've got customers all year saying that, you know, they basically, you know, sat on product that they bought in January and February and barely sold any of it, you know, all the way pretty much through the year. Things are starting to pick up now and move, which is great, but, you know, there's a lot of companies, I think, that are, you know, they're going to feel that for the next couple of years, where, you know, that product, obviously, you know, it's still going to run through the end users and it's going to create issues. There's just no way around that. You know, I'm grateful that I feel like we didn't have a crystal ball, but we definitely put our own brakes down a lot earlier than I've heard, you know, some of our competitors even, where we didn't get stuck with as much. We definitely read the writing on the wall, pulled back to a comfortable scale, and everything at this point, and has been for the last several months, has been pretty damn fresh in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, and I have to give a hats off moment to our production and management team for really biting the bullet heavily on that. They recognized the pattern. We stopped production. We said, hey, we're going to move through the material we have. And as it started becoming apparent that, hey, some of this is going to sit till next year, we actually took a different approach and decided, you know what, we're going to get rid of this product in a different way. We're going to identify community gardens, we're going to identify nonprofits, schools, things like this that have a need for product.
Native tribes.
The native tribes, a wide variety of different avenues to get the product out to people instead of selling it through the traditional channels, and protecting our end user that's out there buying a bag and expecting a certain level of quality. So, the decision was made from the top down. You know what? We're not selling this product. We're going to start making fresh product and shipping it now. This stuff, while 99% of it was probably pristine, it just wasn't worth the risk.
Sure. And that's always been our MO, is really just putting the best possible product out there. It's always been a deep concern, being in the Emerald Triangle, being in Humboldt, where a lot of our customers are our own friends and family and neighbors, and it's our community. We've always kind of been held to a pretty high standard as far as quality goes because of that. So it's definitely a great feeling to know that we do care about that stuff. We're taking it on the chin. Obviously, all of that is of course at a loss financially. But man, talk about polishing a turd or making the best out of a shitty situation. Because the gratification that I'm getting back when we're donating to schools' garden programs, it's amazing. That's a huge break for a lot of nonprofits, to be able to, a lot of them are expanding their gardens. They never even thought that they would be able to do because they couldn't afford it. But, and all of a sudden now they're actually putting out some massive garden space and sending us cards in the mail and big thank yous. And it's awesome.
So with all of these levels and layers of concerns and quality control and old product, one of the biggest things I see with older product, stuck in the distribution chain is molds, mildews, and funguses. Nate, what's your 2 cents on that? I know some of these molds and myceliums are perfectly fine for most plants and maybe even beneficial. I understand that consumers at home, they open a bag and they see something funky like that, they may not want to use it, and I totally understand and get why. What are the biggest issues with some of those things?
So I guess it kind of depends on what level of gardening you're doing, right? Like, do you have just a few outdoor beds? Do you have a huge production facility that's climate controlled, right? So the level is really different. If you're a home gardener and you find a little bit of fungus, a little bit of algae in your bag, it's really not much of a cause for concern. It's going to be outside. There's going to be other natural checks and balances to deal with it. And most of those things, once you open the bag and expose them to the environment, they don't have that kind of, most of the time when you open up a bag, most of those things are just going to dissipate. They don't have that controlled environment where things are nice and humid and moist, and they're also compacted down. Once you freshen up that soil by even just dumping it out of the bag, a lot of time that disrupts any mycelial networks, and you start growing plants in it. It's outside, it gets warm, it's cold. Those temperature swings are going to be a lot different than how it's stored in a pallet where it's collecting and holding onto that heat. So that kind of stuff, it's not really much of an issue. It's not something to really be concerned about. Now, if you can see that the medium's obviously affected, like it's changed different colors
or physical properties,
or it's clumpy and chunky, and it's changed, then talk to where you bought it from and see what they can do about it. But if it's minimal, and I said if it's outside, I wouldn't worry about it. Now, if you've got a high level production facility where cleanliness is key, then it's kind of a little bit of a different concern, right?
Yeah.
It's probably not going to cause any problems. But can you really take that chance? No.
Yeah, you have to look at it from a little bit of a different lens.
It's a much more economic decision, right, than it is, growing a handful of tomatoes in your backyard.
Yeah, if you're growing for your own cupboards, so to speak, regardless of what it is you're growing, you probably have a little more flexibility than someone that's depending on generating a certain amount of weight at a certain quality on a certain price point. And I can see those bigger facilities wanting to make sure and dig through that process and make sure they're getting clean matter.
Yeah. So those are kind of the 2-level concerns. Now, if you have product that like looks funky, smells funky, that's something to be avoided. That rotten egg, sulfur smell, that means some things have gone on that really shouldn't have gone on, and they definitely didn't leave the facility in that fashion.
Yeah, that makes sense. The sour and the sulfur, that's a no-go. If it smells bad, like not earthy and organic and composting, if it smells bad, think twice. Yeah.
If you need to, throw it in a compost pile. That's probably not going to hurt anything for you. But if you're trying to grow things in it, especially smaller containers, it's going to cause some issues in the long run.
Especially if you got fragile roots, things like that would definitely be an issue. Now, one thing I've had a lot of dialogue with consumers about is, okay, hey, I've got these mushrooms growing. There's, a lot of different mushrooms that grow on organic matter and funguses in general. The most common we see and hear on all plant mediums is shockingly known as the plant pot parasol, because it grows in plant pots. Typically when they're wet, typically when they're cool.
You mean it has nothing to do with pot itself?
You'd be shocked, because 99% of the calls are, why are there mushrooms in my pot? But
right.
it really, it's an interesting organism, because we have seen it take over in pots and be an issue, and it's typically associated with overwatering and some amount of user error, because once it's there, it holds more water. People keep watering on top of it. It kind of, tends to snowball sometimes. If you find yourself dealing with something like that at home, give yourself an extended dry down. Not till where your plants wilt, but dry it down thoroughly. But the question I'm hearing from people is, well, are those organisms consuming the other nutrients in my soil that I'm giving it, because I'm feeding my same program and now I'm having, various deficiencies, or I'm having issues? What do you know about that?
The deficiencies are more likely related to the watering, right? And what's in the water, like what type of fertilizer you're putting in. And a lot of times people try to overcompensate, or they think they're seeing, an excess of something, and then they just start using regular water, just plain water. With the plant pot parasols, they definitely like it damp. The place that I see it, even sometimes in my house, are the plants that really just don't take up a lot of water. Even if you're watering them infrequently, they stay wet for a long time, just because your plants aren't transpiring, and they start growing. Almost always, if you pick those things out and get rid of them, and like you said, let it dry down, your issue's pretty much done. Those funguses' job really is to break down the carbon, right? Okay. They're using some nutrient too, but it's minimal unless you've got a pot that's infested. And if you're at that point, you probably have other issues going on than just the fungus that's growing, right? You've got nutrient imbalances, overwatering, causing lack of root aeration. Like, there's other stuff going on if that's what you're seeing. A couple of them popping up in a few pots, just pick them out. You'll be fine.
Not a threat.
What would you say for, advice for customers? Generally those plant pot parasols, they like to come out of the bottom holes of a pot.
They do that sometimes too, yeah.
Right? They pop out, and obviously the detriment there is that they're going to clog it and kind of prevent some of the drainage, right? So, I always just pop them off. Is there any technique that you would advise as far as, breaking through the medium, through that hole? Is it necessary? How far back would you say the actual fungus is? Would you poke it with anything? Would you try to aerate it a little bit from there?
I mean, if they're well established, like if they've grown to full size and, let their spores go, then yeah, maybe dig back a little bit further. But if you just start, if they've just barely poked out, they haven't put down enough mycelial growth to probably affect anything.
Yeah, I would chalk one more recommendation up there to That's why I like fabric pots. It breathes better. You don't trap moisture along the edges, in the corners, on the bottom, and there's no hole there for those mushrooms to pop out of.
It's true.
Yep,
Yeah.
If you don't see them, they don't exist.
And that's really why they're grow. That's why, like you said, like people will see them grow there is because where's the wettest part of your pot?
Sure.
At the very bottom, always. Like the moisture really the moisture isn't ever really leaving that probably bottom inch or two of your pot, right? It's always moist just because gravity. So unless you do have like a fabric pot that's like sitting up on a pallet, on a tray, that stuff isn't going to dry all the way, and so that's why you're seeing them in those little pockets there.
Yeah, they've never really bothered me. Obviously, it's always a sign of good, healthy soil. Most customers see that and they do agree. For the most part, that is something that I feel like, that they seek that kind of active life in their soil. I mean, obviously, we're in an industry where biology products are huge. I mean, there's just a monster industry all in itself. So it's almost like a head start. It's like a free head start when you see your soil having a little bit of growth and a little bit of activity. Most good growers know that that's a benefit for the most part.
Well, and I do understand where tuber customers specifically would be a little more likely to have an issue with that, because for the most part, tuber growers are providing all of their nutrition via water. They're running, more aggressive feeding systems. It's more of a hydroponic approach, and yeah, you're trying to minimize the biology that isn't specifically controlled within those systems, right? You've got a, very cut and dry, clean, sometimes attempting to be sterile ecosystem that you're creating, and so I can see that concern. And luckily, tuber is one of those mediums that's so dry it doesn't often end up in the conditions that would allow that, unless it's been overwatered or stored in a situation where it gathered extra moisture and was stored improperly somehow, or there was a rip in the plastic on the pallet covering or something like that. And so in general, you don't see it as much on the tuber, but I can also see why those cultivators are more concerned and more aware of those issues.
Sure. Yeah, they're the ones that get a little more freaked out, for sure. If you're outdoor, generally you see stuff like that. It's just like weeds popping up and everything else. You're just like, it's part of the cycle of life, Indoor, when you're working on a clean, sterile environment, it's definitely a little bit more of a freak out issue, for sure.
Yeah, if you're used to using something sterile like rock wool, you're not going to see mushrooms growing that. You certainly see algae growing in it. But you're used to that. So seeing those little mushrooms pop up gives people that little bit of a scare. But if you think about it, we add all sorts of fungal species to our mixes. We just don't want to see their fruiting bodies.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we know the fungus helps break down the potassium and phosphorus and move it around, and is a crucial part of healthy soil, and is also extremely fragile. And that's a big part of the whole no-till movement and part of the whole soil extinction concept, right? Because we've disrupted so many soil networks, removed the fungus by, tilling and like Dust Bowl style. We've decimated the health of the soil to the point where it's not bound together by the structure anymore, and kind of begins to erode. The organic matter runs away. It runs into rivers and creeks and things like that. And so I think one interesting kind of perspective is when you're saying, okay, well, in rock wool you're going to have algae and things like that. Well, you're kind of naturally self-selecting for those things. You're creating an environment where bacteria or algae or whatever would thrive on that top surface. Rock wool is similar to tuber in a lot of ways, that it holds a lot of oxygen when it's fully saturated. But in the tuber, you're self-selecting more for fungus because you've got high lignin components. And if you're familiar with our podcast, if you listened before, I may sound like a broken record because of this lignin conversation, but it's really important, and it kind of highlights a lot of the functionality and a lot of the reasons for the things that happen in our soil versus when you're using rock wool or something else.
You probably talk about lignin a lot in your everyday life. I actually don't think we've covered it that many times on this podcast.
Wow.
For as great a role as it is in what we do, You know, I don't think we've really talked about it as much. You talk about it in your sleep, so you're like, God.
Well, yeah, I think about it constantly. So if you see me out at a trade show, folks, come by, let's talk lignin.
Come ask about his lignin.
Lignin and cellulose, the building blocks. Yep. Well, you know, this episode was really an opportunity to get together, kind of talk about spring prep, talk about what we're doing, talk about what you're doing at home and how to get your garden ready, how to make sure there's nutrients in there, ready to go for your spring. So when you're planting, they're going to take off and get the best possible start, build your biology correctly, things like that. And, you know, I really appreciate you guys both taking the time. It's a sunny, late winter, early spring kind of morning, and hope everyone out there is getting out in the garden as much as possible, or when the snow melts, maybe take some of these things to heart, get some fresh amendments in your soil, add some biology. Let's see what we can do this year.
Yeah, there's a company called Royal Gold that just came out with Crown Jewels. You should try it. It's amazing.
Thanks again for listening to Royal Grown Radio. I'm Michael Beck.
I'm Rick Elliott.
I'm Nate Swenson.
We'll see you again next time.